April 19, 1945. The sun climbed over Okinawa's ridgelines as 30 Sherman tanks rumbled toward Kakazu Ridge. Inside these machines, the air was thick and suffocating. Diesel fumes mixed with hydraulic fluid and the acrid chemical stink of napalm. The temperature inside exceeded 100 degrees even before the hatches closed. Through narrow vision slits, tank commanders watched the terrain ahead, searching for the enemy they knew was waiting. These weren't ordinary Shermans. Their main guns had been removed and replaced with flamethrowers. The men of the 713th Tank Battalion had trained for months to operate these modified vehicles. They'd crossed the Pacific anticipating this moment. They understood what these weapons could do. They'd seen the reports from Iwo Jima. They knew Japanese soldiers feared flame tanks above all other weapons. What they were about to discover was that the Japanese had been watching too. They'd been learning. And they'd developed a response that would turn this day into the greatest single loss of American armor in the entire Pacific campaign. By afternoon, 22 tanks lay destroyed or disabled on the approaches to Kakazu Ridge. Most were knocked out not by anti-tank guns or artillery, but by men carrying explosives who charged directly at the tanks, knowing they would die in the attempt. 6 of the destroyed tanks were flamethrower vehicles. The crews who survived found themselves trapped inside disabled machines, while Japanese soldiers forced turret lids open and threw grenades inside. The flame tank, nicknamed the Zippo by American troops, had become the most effective weapon for clearing Japanese fortifications. And because it was so effective, the Japanese were willing to die to stop it. The Fortress Islands. Understanding why men would charge tanks carrying explosives requires understanding the impossible situation American forces faced in the Pacific. The Germans fought from bunkers and fortifications, but they surrendered when positions became untenable. Japanese soldiers did not surrender. They fought until death, and they'd had months or even years to prepare their defenses. On Okinawa, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded over 100,000 troops who had constructed what may have been the most formidable defensive position Americans encountered in any Pacific campaign. They'd carved caves into volcanic rock and coral limestone. They'd connected those caves with tunnels running hundreds of feet underground. Some tunnel networks extended to depths of 100 feet, completely immune to naval bombardment or aerial attack. They'd installed steel blast doors that could withstand direct hits from the largest naval guns. They'd positioned machine guns and artillery pieces with overlapping fields of fire designed to shred any infantry assault. The statistics were staggering. The Japanese had built over 60 miles of tunnels beneath the ridges of southern Okinawa. Artillery positions were dug into reverse slopes where naval gunfire couldn't reach them. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Fresh water was piped in. Electric lighting powered by generators allowed troops to operate in total darkness. Some cave complexes had multiple levels connected by staircases cut into solid rock. Ventilation shafts provided fresh air to defenders who could wait indefinitely in their fortified positions. American commanders had seen this before, at Tarawa, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima. They'd learned that conventional weapons were nearly useless against this kind of defense. At Tarawa in November 1943, 3 days of naval bombardment barely scratched Japanese fortifications. Concrete bunkers remained intact. Marines died by the hundreds trying to take positions that high explosives couldn't touch. The official casualty count exceeded 3,000 Americans killed or wounded in just 76 hours of fighting. The entire Japanese garrison of nearly 5,000 men died, almost none surrendering. The problem was clear. Bullets couldn't penetrate fortified positions. Grenades couldn't reach deep into cave networks. Artillery and naval guns, no matter how powerful, couldn't collapse reinforced positions built into solid rock. Tank shells bounced off concrete walls or were absorbed by layers of earth covering bunker roofs. Infantry assaults against these positions were suicide missions that accomplished little except filling casualty lists. But fire could do what explosives couldn't. Fire consumed oxygen inside enclosed spaces. Fire followed the curves of tunnels and reached chambers that no other weapon could touch. Fire forced defenders to abandon their positions or die where they hid. And when Americans mounted flamethrowers on tanks and wrapped them in armor, They created a weapon that could approach Japanese positions and survive long enough to burn them out. The Japanese noticed immediately. Birth of the Flame. The story of American flame tanks begins in Hawaii, at Schofield Barracks, in the spring of 1944. Colonel George F. Unmacht was the chief chemical officer for the Central Pacific area. Born in Dubuque, Iowa in 1887, he'd enlisted in the Iowa National Guard at age 16 and spent his entire career in chemical warfare. When Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, he was among the first officers to reach headquarters, directing gas mask distribution to troops who feared follow-up attacks might include chemical weapons. In May of 1944, the Navy delivered 5 Mark I flamethrowers to Hawaii. The Navy had deemed them unsuitable for naval use. They were too heavy for shipboard application. But Unmacht saw an opportunity. If he could mount those flamethrowers on armored vehicles, he could solve the portable flamethrowers' vulnerability problem. The backpack units carried by Marines were devastatingly effective against bunkers, but the men carrying them had a life expectancy in combat measured in minutes. The bright orange flame made them instant targets for every Japanese rifleman and machine gunner within range. Most flamethrower operators didn't survive their first engagement. The casualty rate among men carrying the M2 flamethrower exceeded 90% in some units. Unmacht assembled a top-secret composite unit to develop tank-mounted flamethrowers. Personnel came from the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company, the 5th Marine Tank Battalion, and 25 men from the 117th Naval Construction Battalion, the Seabees. The work was unglamorous and dangerous. Engineers had to design mounting systems that could withstand combat conditions. They had to create fuel delivery mechanisms that wouldn't fail under stress. They had to figure out how to protect crews from their own weapon if something went wrong. The Seabees proved essential to the project. When they examined the Army's original designs, they concluded the systems were over-engineered. They simplified the mechanisms, making them more reliable and easier to maintain in field conditions. The first prototype was an M3 Stuart light tank with a Ronson flamethrower replacing the main gun. They called it Satan. The fuel capacity was small and the range barely better than portable units, but it worked. A flamethrower protected by tank armor could approach Japanese positions and survive. The first Satan was christened Hells Afire. Unmacht personally supervised its testing, watching as streams of flame shot from the turret and engulfed target structures. The heat was intense even from 50 yards away. Men watching the demonstration understood instantly why this weapon would terrify defenders in fortified positions. Each tank conversion required 1,200 man-hours of labor. Welders worked around the clock. Electricians rewired 1,100 connections per vehicle. Machinists fabricated 150 custom parts for each installation. The 75mm main gun was completely removed and replaced with the flamethrower tube. Installation required 150 pounds of welding rod per tank. The estimated cost was between $20,000 and $25,000 per unit. By June of 1944, Unmacht's team had converted 24 M3 light tanks into Satans for the upcoming Marianas campaign. They were sent to Saipan and Tinian. The results would exceed all expectations and change the nature of Pacific warfare forever. Satan's first strike on Saipan in June 1944, American forces encountered the same nightmare they'd faced on every island: Japanese defenders in fortified caves who refused to surrender. But this time, they had a new weapon. The flame tanks operated in coordination with infantry assault teams. Standard gun tanks provided covering fire and engaged anti-tank weapons. The flame tanks approached to within 100 to 150 feet of target positions. Infantry provided close protection against suicide attackers. When all elements were in position, the flame tank fired. The effect was devastating. Japanese defenders who had survived naval bombardment, artillery barrages, and infantry assault couldn't survive the flames. Marines who had watched friends die attacking fortified positions now watched Japanese soldiers run screaming from caves as liquid fire poured inside. Those who tried to remain in their positions died from asphyxiation or burns. Those who fled were cut down by waiting riflemen. Either way, positions that had cost Marine lives to assault conventionally fell quickly when flame tanks were available. A 1st Marine Division history recorded the impact plainly. The flame tank was the one weapon that caused the Japanese to leave their caves and rock crevices and run. But the most telling evidence of the weapon's effectiveness came from the Japanese themselves. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded the Japanese garrison on Saipan. By early July, American forces had pushed his remaining troops into the northern corner of the island. Saito understood that continued conventional defense was impossible. The flame tanks had burned through position after position. On July 6th, Saito issued his final order. All remaining Japanese forces would conduct Gyokusai, Shattered Jewel, a mass suicide attack intended to die, inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy. It was the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. Nearly 4,000 Japanese soldiers assembled near Makuna village. Many carried rifles. Some carried only bamboo spears with bayonets lashed to the ends. Wounded men hobbled forward with grenades tied to poles. At 4:45 on the morning of July 7th, they struck American lines. The attack lasted 15 hours. Japanese soldiers overran aid stations, artillery positions, and command posts. They fought with bayonets, swords, and bare hands when ammunition ran out. American machine guns cut them down by the hundreds, but still they came. When it ended, almost every Japanese participant was dead. American casualties reached approximately 900 killed and wounded. Lieutenant General Saito had committed seppuku the night before, disemboweling himself with his sword rather than witness the final destruction of his command. But the Gyokusai at Saipan wasn't primarily an attack against flame tanks. It was a last desperate attempt to die with honor before annihilation. The Japanese military had not yet developed specific tactics for destroying the armored flamethrowers. That would come later, as the flames spread across the Pacific and Japanese commanders studied what made these weapons effective and what made them vulnerable. Japanese eyes open. The true evolution of Japanese anti-flame tank tactics began at Peleliu in September 1944. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded approximately 11,000 Japanese defenders on an island 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. Unlike previous commanders, Nakagawa rejected the traditional strategy of defending beaches and conducting banzai charges when positions became untenable. Instead, he ordered his men to dig in and fight a war of attrition. Nakagawa understood something his predecessors had missed. The Americans expected banzai charges. They prepared for them with interlocking fields of machine gun fire and artillery concentrations. Mass attacks into those kill zones accomplished nothing except the rapid destruction of Japanese forces. But if defenders remained in their fortified positions and forced the Americans to come to them, every yard of advance would cost American blood. The Umurbrogel Mountain, which Americans would call Bloody Nose Ridge, contained more than 500 natural limestone caves. Japanese engineers connected them with tunnels, installed sliding steel doors over entrances, and modified openings to defend against grenades and flamethrowers. They angled cave mouths so that direct fire couldn't penetrate. They created multiple exits so that defenders could escape when one entrance was compromised. The 1st Marine Division landed on September 15, 1944. Major General William Rupertus predicted the island would fall within 4 days. He was wrong by more than 2 months. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller led his 1st Marines into the ridges, expecting to break through Japanese defenses as they had elsewhere. Instead, his regiment was systematically destroyed. Puller's 1st Marines suffered 70% casualties, 1,749 men, before being pulled off the line. The regiment was combat ineffective. Flame tanks arrived at Peleliu and proved essential for clearing the island's cave positions. Colonel Harold Bucky Harris of the 5th Marines adopted siege tactics using bulldozers and flamethrower tanks to methodically destroy Japanese positions. The process was slow, brutal, and effective. Cave by cave, tunnel by tunnel, the Americans burned their way into the Umurbrogel. Some caves required multiple attacks as defenders retreated deeper into tunnel networks, only to emerge from alternate exits and resume fighting. Colonel Nakagawa sent a final message on November 24th. he reported burning his regimental colors and dividing his remaining 56 men into groups with orders to attack the enemy wherever they found them. That night, 25 Japanese were killed attempting to infiltrate American lines. The following morning, prisoners confirmed that Nakagawa and Major General Kenjiro Murai had both committed ritual suicide in their command post. But before dying, Nakagawa's men had learned valuable lessons. They observed that flame tanks operated most effectively when infantry accompanied them closely. The escorting soldiers protected the tanks from close assault while the tanks burned fortified positions. Separate them and the tanks became vulnerable. This observation would form the basis of a new Japanese doctrine that would reach its full development on Okinawa. The 713th, a battalion of fire. For the Okinawa campaign, the Army decided that an entire tank battalion would convert to flame. The 713th Tank Battalion was created from the 3rd Battalion of the 42nd Armored Regiment of the 11th Armored Division. The regiment had been organized on August 15, 1942 at Camp Polk, Louisiana. While the rest of the 11th Armored Division deployed to Europe, the 713th headed for the Pacific. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas L. McCrary of Arlington, Virginia, commanded the battalion. On November 10, 1944, he received orders to convert all 54 of his M4 Sherman tanks to flamethrowers. This would be the first and only tank battalion in the world equipped entirely with flame tanks. At Schofield Barracks, Seabees supervised the conversion using Canadian Ronson systems. 3 officers and 60 enlisted men from the battalion worked alongside the Seabees, learning maintenance procedures and operational techniques. The Ronson flamethrowers had shorter range than the CBH-1 used at Iwo Jima, approximately 80 to 100 yards, compared to 120 to 150 yards for the Hawaiian design systems, but they were available in quantity. The first converted tank arrived on December 25th, Christmas Day. All 54 were completed by January 25th, 1945. The battalion trained intensively during the conversion process. Colonel Unmacht's Chemical Warfare Service personnel conducted comprehensive 40-hour courses on flame tank operation, maintenance, and tactical employment. Crews learned to coordinate with infantry escort. They practiced approaching fortified positions. They trained on fuel management, target selection, and withdrawal procedures. The hose extension was a particular innovation, allowing operators to reach pockets of defenders that couldn't be flamed directly. Navy fire hose in 50-foot lengths gave tanks up to 400 feet of reach. This would prove invaluable on Okinawa's cliffs and escarpments. The battalion departed Pearl Harbor on March 4, 1945, aboard 10 landing ships. Crucial items of ammunition, fuel, rations, and supplies were divided among the ships to ensure that the loss of any single vessel wouldn't cripple the unit. One tank was lost when it drove into a hole on the reef during unloading and was deemed unrecoverable. The battalion would begin the campaign with 53 flamethrower tanks. The 713th was in action continuously from April 7th to June 30th, 1945, 85 consecutive days of combat. Its mission was to support both Army and Marine Corps infantry in assaulting the Shuri Line. Each company of tanks would be parceled out to frontline units as needed. The crews understood they possessed the weapon Japanese defenders feared most. What they were about to learn was just how far those defenders were willing to go to destroy that weapon. Doctrine of Death. Lieutenant General Ushijima had organized independent anti-tank companies specifically for suicide missions against American armor. These units were formed from volunteers who understood they were not expected to survive. They were taught to embrace death as the highest form of service to the Emperor. Their training emphasized a specific sequence: drive off the infantry with small arms and mortars, leave the tanks blind, then attack with explosives. The Japanese called it Nikahaku Keki, human bullet attack, 1 soldier, 1 tank. The doctrine had evolved significantly since Saipan. Japanese instructors drilled the principle into volunteers. 1 flame tank destroyed meant dozens of lives saved. The weapon the Americans had developed to burn defenders out of their caves was now the priority target above all others. Knock out the flame tanks first, then deal with the gun tanks. The volunteers came from units that had seen what flame tanks could do. They had watched flames pour into caves where their comrades were hiding. They had heard the screaming. These men understood that death by fire was terrible beyond description, and they were willing to die to prevent it from happening to others. They wrote final letters to their families before suicide missions. They performed purification rituals. They made peace with death before they went to die. Some of those letters survive, preserved in museum collections. They speak of duty and honor, of love for family and homeland, of acceptance of fate. They do not speak of fear, though the fear must have been overwhelming. One word that appears frequently in Japanese documents is gyokusai, shattered jewel, the ancient Chinese concept meaning to die gallantly rather than suffer the shame of being taken prisoner alive. Prime Minister Tojo Hideki had said Ichioku Gyokusai, essentially a notice that the entire Japanese population should be prepared to die. The tactics had evolved far beyond the banzai charges of earlier campaigns. Japanese soldiers no longer charged blindly at tanks in the open. Instead, they concealed themselves in fighting positions along likely tank approaches. They waited until American infantry moved forward, past their positions. Then, they emerged from spider holes and concealed entrances to attack the tanks from behind or from the flanks. Concealment was essential. A soldier would dig a shallow hole just deep enough to lie flat with minimal profile. He would cover himself with vegetation, rocks, or dirt until he was invisible from more than a few feet away. He would remain motionless for hours, sometimes days, waiting for a tank to approach within striking distance. He would control his breathing, ignore thirst and hunger, suppress every natural instinct to move or adjust position. Some soldiers concealed themselves in spider holes directly in the path of advancing flame tanks. When a tank rolled overhead, the soldier would rise, detonate explosives, and die while attempting to destroy the vehicle. Others waited in bottle-shaped holes that allowed them to stand upright but remain invisible until the moment of attack. When the moment came, the attacker would have only seconds to act. Rise from concealment, pull the fuse or igniter, close the distance, deliver the charge. The explosion would kill him. If he was lucky, it would destroy the tank as well. Weapons of desperation. The weapons developed for this purpose ranged from improvised to manufactured. The most common was the satchel charge, a cloth bag filled with explosives and fitted with a short fuse. It could be thrown onto the engine deck where armor was thinnest. Alternatively, a soldier could dash beneath a tank and place the charge against the belly armor before detonating it. Either method usually killed the attacker, but both could disable or destroy a tank. Japanese engineers studied captured American tanks to identify their weakest points. They learned that the Sherman's engine deck was vulnerable to concentrated explosive attack. They discovered that tracks and suspension could be destroyed by charges placed against the road wheels. They found that ammunition stored in certain locations could be detonated by explosives placed against the hull. The Type 99 magnetic demolition charge was particularly feared by American tank crews. It consisted of 8 separate sticks of TNT assembled in a circle with 4 powerful magnets attached by canvas ribbon. The total weight was approximately 43 ounces with 26 ounces of explosive. A soldier would approach a tank from a blind spot, slap the charge against the hull, and retreat if possible or detonate in place if not. The charge could penetrate 3/4 of an inch of armor when used singly or 1 1/4 inches when 2 charges were stacked together. This was sufficient to breach the Sherman's thinner armor on the engine deck, belly plate, or rear. A 5 to 10 second time delay fuse gave the attacker a chance to escape, but many chose to remain and ensure the charge detonated against a vital point. But the most terrifying weapon was the lunge mine, the Shitotsu Bakurai, which translates to piercing thunderbolt. It was a conical-shaped charge mounted on a 2-meter wooden pole. The explosive weighed approximately 3 kilograms and could penetrate 150 millimeters of armor at perpendicular impact. 3 metal prongs on the base ensured proper standoff distance for maximum penetration. The total weapon weighed about 14 pounds and measured 78 inches in length, including the 59-inch wooden handle. The weapon was officially adopted by the Japanese Army in 1944, with first combat use at Leyte in the Philippines in December of that year. A captured Japanese document dated December 13, 1944, confirmed its deployment. To use the lunge mine, a soldier removed the safety pin while approaching the target tank. He held the pole with both hands, explosive tip forward, and charged. When the prongs struck armor, the handle slid forward into the housing, triggering the detonator. The resulting explosion killed the user instantly while hopefully destroying or disabling the tank. American intelligence analyzed the weapon and characterized it as perhaps the oddest of the Japanese anti-tank charges. Reports noted that all attempts by Japanese soldiers to use the lunge mine against American tanks had met with failure in early encounters. American tankers learned to spray likely ambush points with machine gun fire. Infantry accompanying the tanks scouted ahead and protected flanks, but the reports weren't entirely accurate. Lunge mine attacks did occasionally succeed, particularly against flame tanks that approached close to cave entrances and ridge positions. The close range required for flamethrower operations meant flame tanks frequently entered the effective range of suicide attackers who had learned patience and concealment. Kakuzu, the killing ground. The attack at Kakuzu Ridge on April 19th demonstrated the vulnerability perfectly. The plan called for tanks to sweep around the left side of Kakuzu, meet infantry on the other side, and reduce enemy positions together. But the infantry never arrived. Japanese machine guns and mortars drove back the American foot soldiers, leaving the tanks to operate alone. That was exactly what the Japanese wanted. Company A of the 193rd Tank Battalion and the 1st Platoon of Company B from the 713th Tank Battalion, the latter in its first action, were detailed to support the 105th Infantry Regiment's attack. Approximately 30 tanks, assault guns, and flamethrowers moved off that morning. As the first tanks neared the objective, they were taken under fire by a 47mm anti-tank gun from the left flank. 2 flamethrowers and 3 tanks were hit by this gun before it was spotted and destroyed. The tanks that made it past this ambush found themselves in the village of Kakuzu, isolated from infantry support. They moved around and through the village, spreading fire and destruction. For 3 hours they burned Japanese positions, but Japanese suicide squads had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Soldiers concealed in spider holes waited until tanks rolled past, then emerged to attack from behind. Others threw explosive charges onto engine decks or shoved them beneath hulls. 14 American tanks were destroyed in and around the village. Many fell to mines and anti-tank guns. Others succumbed to suicide close attack units. More were damaged by artillery and mortar fire. The crews who survived their vehicles being disabled often faced worse fates. Japanese soldiers forced turret lids open and threw in grenades, killing men trapped inside. At 13:30, the battalion's operations officer convinced the regimental commanding officer to permit the tanks to withdraw. Because so many command tanks had been knocked out, nobody was certain that everyone had gotten the message. The operations officer set out in his Sherman to make sure. All tanks were pulling back, but by the time that was clear, his tank had hit a mine behind Japanese lines and had to be abandoned. Of the 30 tanks that had maneuvered around Kakuzu Ridge that morning, only 8 returned to American lines. 6 of the destroyed tanks were flamethrowers. It was the greatest single-day loss of American armor on Okinawa and in the entire Pacific War. The crews who survived learned a lesson that would define the rest of the campaign. Flame tanks needed infantry protection at all times. Without it, they were vulnerable to men willing to die. The Japanese had proven that suicide tactics could stop even the most feared American weapon, but they had also demonstrated the terrible cost of that strategy. Every Japanese soldier who destroyed a tank died in the attempt. Every suicide attack was a one-way mission. The question was whether Japan had enough willing volunteers to sustain this level of sacrifice across an entire campaign. The answer, unfortunately for both sides, was yes. Okinawa's Inferno. The 713th adapted. Tactics evolved through bloody experience. Flame tanks would remain in forward assembly areas until called forward by platoon leaders. They would join with standard tanks and infantry only when all elements could move together. The infantry remained close at all times, watching for suicide attackers while the flame tanks burned Japanese positions. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, commanding the American 10th Army, described the tactics as blowtorch and corkscrew. The blowtorch was the flame tank spraying napalm mixture into caves where it stuck to everything it touched. The corkscrew was demolition charges planted to collapse the cave and seal it permanently. Together, they reduced Japanese positions one by one. The commanding general of the 7th Infantry Division reported to Colonel Unmacht of one incident where a captain and sergeant under covering fire reached the top of an escarpment with a hose extension and killed several hundred Japanese soldiers with the deadly flame. The hose extension proved essential for reaching pockets of defenders that couldn't be flamed directly from tank positions. Flamethrower tanks were used for flaming forward and reverse slopes of hills and escarpments, clearing foxholes and bottle-shaped spider holes dug in the earth, cliff caves, and ruins of structures. The 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company had developed a stabilized flamethrower fuel, napalm, and oversaw construction of an activating plant that produced over 250,000 gallons for the campaign. The 713th went through 200,000 gallons on Okinawa. Day after day, the flame tanks consumed thousands of gallons of this jellied gasoline. They burned bunkers. They incinerated cave complexes. They forced Japanese soldiers out of positions that had survived naval bombardment and aerial attack. The battalion killed 4,788 Japanese soldiers and captured 49 during the campaign. They burned out hundreds of caves and fortified positions. Battalion losses were comparatively light, given the intensity of combat. 8 men were killed or missing. 111 were wounded. Enemy anti-tank fire and mines claimed 16 of the battalion's tanks. Another 25 were listed as operational losses. Of the 41 total knocked out, 26 were returned to duty. On the last day of operations, June 30th, the battalion had 37 operational tanks. The ingenuity and hard work of mechanics had kept the unit at over 70% strength after almost 3 months of continuous combat. This was remarkable considering no replacement flame tanks existed anywhere in the theater. The battalion used over 200,000 gallons of napalm. They received a Presidential Unit Citation for their actions. Company B received 2 additional Presidential Unit Citations from the Navy for operations with Marine divisions. But the statistics don't capture the reality of what this warfare meant. Every cave burned meant Japanese soldiers died by fire or suffocation. Every position cleared required Americans to face suicide attackers willing to die for every yard of ground. The systematic destruction of Japanese defenses was achieved through a level of violence that left psychological scars on both sides that would last decades. The human price. For the Japanese defenders, the situation was hopeless from the beginning. They knew they couldn't win. They knew reinforcements weren't coming. They knew the Americans would eventually take the island regardless of how they defended it. But their goal wasn't victory. Their goal was to inflict maximum casualties and buy time for the defense of the homeland. Every American Marine or soldier who died on Okinawa was one less who would invade Japan itself. The defensive network General Ushijima had constructed was extraordinary. But the flame tanks cut through it systematically, position by position, cave by cave. Japanese soldiers wrote final letters before going on suicide missions. They described their love for family and country. They explained their duty to the emperor. They accepted that they would die. But reading between the lines of those preserved letters, you can sense the fear they couldn't express. Charging at a tank with an explosive charge, knowing you would die in the attempt, knowing that even if you succeeded, you wouldn't live to see it, that took a kind of courage that's almost impossible to comprehend. The American crews inside the flame tanks faced their own psychological burden. They operated the weapon Japanese defenders feared most. They knew that made them priority targets. They knew suicide attackers would single them out. They developed a dark reputation among their own troops. American infantry preferred to follow flame tanks over standard gun tanks because of the fear they put in the enemy. But the flame tank crews understood what that reputation meant. Every Japanese soldier with a satchel charge or lunge mine was looking for them specifically. The heat inside a flame tank was nearly unbearable. The smell of napalm mixed with diesel and hydraulic fluid created a stench that soaked into clothing and skin. Through narrow vision slits, crews watched orange flames engulf cave entrances. They heard sounds they couldn't identify over the roar of engines and the whoosh of the flamethrower firing. Sometimes they could hear screaming from inside caves they'd just flamed. Sometimes they heard nothing at all, which was somehow worse. For 85 consecutive days, the men of the 713th went to work burning people alive. They did it because that's what they'd been trained to do. They did it because it saved American lives. They did it because the alternative was sending infantry into those caves, which would cost even more lives. But that doesn't mean it didn't leave scars. Combat fatigue cases from Okinawa exceeded those from any other Pacific battle. The constant bombardment, the close-quarters cave fighting, the endless succession of fortified positions, it broke men mentally as well as physically. On the Japanese side, the toll was even more severe. Of the approximately 107,000 Japanese military deaths on Okinawa, thousands were killed in suicide attacks. Thousands more were sealed in caves, burned alive or suffocated when flame tanks attacked their positions. Another 23,000 were sealed in collapsed tunnels and never recovered. The caves of Okinawa still give up their dead. Explorers occasionally find rifles, helmets, human bones in tunnel complexes that were never completely cleared. Legacy and memory. When the battle ended after 82 days, the casualty figures told a story of almost unimaginable violence. American ground forces suffered approximately 49,000 killed, wounded, or missing. 12,520 were killed or missing in action. The Navy lost another 5,000 dead and 4,900 wounded to kamikaze attacks and conventional airstrikes. Japanese military deaths exceeded 107,000. Another estimated 23,000 were sealed in caves and never recovered. But perhaps the most tragic figure is the civilian death toll. Approximately 140,000 Okinawan civilians died, caught between the two armies. That was nearly 20% of the island's population. Japanese propaganda had convinced many civilians that Americans would torture, rape, and murder anyone they captured. Thousands of Okinawan civilians committed suicide rather than be taken alive. Others were killed in the crossfire. Still others were forced by Japanese soldiers to carry water and supplies under fire, leading to civilian casualties. The Battle of Okinawa convinced American war planners that any invasion of Japan would incur unacceptable casualties. Their estimates, at worst as many as 1 million American servicemen killed or wounded, were a key factor in President Harry Truman's decision to use atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The planned apocalypse of Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan's home islands, never occurred. The atomic bombs dropped in August 1945 ended the war before the invasion could begin. Colonel George F. Unmacht remained in Hawaii after the war, serving as chief chemical officer until his death in January 1954 at Tripler Army Hospital. He was buried at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific with full military honors. In 1995, he was posthumously inducted into the United States Army Chemical Corps Hall of Fame. The weapons his team created set the standard for American mechanized flamethrower operations through the Korean War. When Communist forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, the Marine Corps assembled a platoon of 9 flame tanks from survivors of Unmacht's wartime production. Called the Flame Dragons, they formed a platoon attached to headquarters of the 1st Tank Battalion. They landed at Incheon in September 1950 and participated in the First Battle of Seoul. North Korean soldiers attacking American tanks with satchel charges strapped to their bodies discovered that the tactics of the Pacific War were still being practiced. The Flame Dragons burned enemy positions just as their predecessors had done on Okinawa 5 years earlier. It wasn't until 1955 that a superior design, the M67, based on the M48 Patton tank, replaced the Shermans the Seabees had built in Hawaii. The United States military continued to field flamethrower tanks through the Vietnam War, where M67 Zippos burned enemy positions in the jungles and villages of Southeast Asia. In 1978, the Department of Defense unilaterally discontinued flamethrower use. Public opinion had turned decisively against weapons that burned people alive. No treaty required the decision. No international law mandated it. The United States simply chose to stop using a weapon it had employed to devastating effect for 3 decades. The caves of Okinawa are quiet now. The ridges where thousands died have grown over with vegetation. Tourists visit Shuri Castle, rebuilt in 1992 after its destruction in the battle. Peace memorials honor the dead of all nations. The cornerstone of Peace Monument lists 234,183 names. Everyone who died, Japanese, American, Okinawan, regardless of nationality or allegiance. Old men sometimes return, American veterans who fought in the caves, Japanese survivors who hid in the tunnels. They walk the same ground where they once tried to kill each other. They stand at memorials and remember friends who didn't survive. Most don't speak of what they experienced. The words don't exist for what they saw and did. Some caves remain sealed to this day. The bodies inside were never recovered. The island keeps yielding its dead, decade after decade. At the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, exhibits document the flame tank operations. Preserved examples of the POA-CW-SH-1 and POA-CW-SH-5 stand as monuments to what Unmacht's team accomplished. Young soldiers walk past them on their way to classes. Few stop to consider what these weapons represented, both the lives they saved and the terrible price paid by those who faced them. The story of the flame tanks and the men who threw their lives away trying to stop them is ultimately a story about the extremes humans will reach when pushed to the breaking point. Japanese soldiers charged at armored vehicles with explosives because they believed it was their duty, because they feared what would happen if they didn't, and because their culture and their military had prepared them to see death in combat as the highest honor. American crews operated weapons that burned people alive because it was the most effective way to save their own troops' lives, because conventional weapons had failed, and because someone had to do the terrible job of clearing fortified positions one cave at a time. Neither side was made up of monsters. Both were made up of young men who found themselves in an impossible situation, doing things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, because war had left them no other choice. The flame tanks worked. They saved American lives. They helped win the battle for Okinawa. But the Japanese suicide attacks also worked. They destroyed irreplaceable equipment, slowed the American advance, and demonstrated that even the most feared weapon could be stopped by men willing to die. The price was measured not just in the 8,500 American dead, or the 100,000 Japanese military deaths, or the 140,000 Okinawan civilian deaths. It was measured in the psychological damage done to survivors on both sides. It was measured in the caves that remain sealed today, because nobody wants to go back and find what's inside. It was measured in the silence of old men who returned to Okinawa decades later and couldn't bring themselves to talk about what they'd done there. War produces innovations in how humans kill each other. The flame tank was one such innovation, effective, terrifying, and ultimately abandoned, because even the nations that developed it eventually decided some weapons are too terrible to use. But for 82 days on Okinawa in the spring of 1945, flame tanks and the men trying to stop them wrote a chapter of history that reminds us what happens when warfare reaches its most desperate extremes. If you found this video informative, please hit that like button and subscribe to WW2 Unveiled for more deep dives into the battles that shaped our world. Thanks for watching.